Good afternoon. I would like to introduce a thought on the discussion and the recognition of ayahuasca as a cultural heritage and material heritage in Brazil after the application of the so-called religious lines in Brazil and underwritten by the Secretariat of Culture of Rio Branco, capital of Acre, the Institute of Natural and Artistic Heritage. Process was created to identify the senses and practices that make of the ritual use of ayahuasca a cultural reference for collectivities and national formation and identity, according to the terms set out by the policy of cultural policy. History of the process, including an inventory, shall brought forward by which a research team will introduce then awareness raising of local agents, stakeholders in heritage building, a phenomenon that is deeply related with expansion of the use of ayahuasca for the most varied geographical regions, the realization of seminars in which the indigenous peoples have decided to deliberate on which are the senses of recognition of ayahuasca as a cultural heritage, as it can be relevant for the continuity of the traditional knowledge and especially the consequences by the raising interest of ayahuasca may have on their culture and community. Then, after this application, the Brazilian government, through its Council of Material Heritage, pointed out that all holders of the regulations having ayahuasca as a cultural reference should be involved in the process. At that point, an expert was called to have conversations with the indigenous people. First, the communication started with indigenous leaders through their organizations, and the first change came about in my thought about the context. Hearing from the talks, one of the ODB, which is represented here, and UDV, which filed the application to the state, which by means of their proposal and the inventory report completed that it would be good to have the registry and recognition of the traditions coming from the three founding masters, of a recognition of their celebration and doctrine, which is in the reality of their communities, in a very heroic way, in the social and history context, in a tradition clearly Afro-Indigenous tradition of the triple frontier between Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru. On the other side, I've heard from the leaders of the nations we are all how we're going to do it together, heritage building. I understand that there are common things among the groups and others where they don't recognize each other. There is an intersection even more between the churches in the department of Acre, where they create together with the indigenous leaders. So there is an intersection of two realities, one abroad and the other where both worlds come together. And when being asked, I said yes, it can be what is the cultural reference for different social groups, and there's historic and political strategies. Especially for the indigenous people, they submitted a proposal at the state in fulfilling what was set out in the Agreement 169, which is part of the national legislation since 2004. the other international covenants on the rights of indigenous peoples, as also expressed in our federal constitution, articles 231, 215, and 216, that guarantees the respect of its usages, customs, and organizations, that an information consultation procedure is initiated on the immaterial heritage policy, its limitations and action policies, and after this stage, promoting the dialogue with other traditions previously quoted. This was my recommendation, and the recommendation was accepted, but we had a crush that the current president were elected, and it was even more difficult for the public budgets and cultural policies. This is from 2016. Nothing has happened ever since. However, there's another dilemma, which is what has to be become heritage according to the political guidelines. Ayahuasca as such cannot be, but its cultural expressions or celebrations or ways of preparing, which is the knowledge related to a cultural practice, which is the reference. I personally, and as a proposal, think that the best common key are the ways of expression, which include narrations of chants, the visualizations of paintings and graphics in the case of indigenous peoples. But this is not everything what is ayahuasca about, for it is a system of knowledge, a way of knowing, of learning, and of curing and healing by the other, and also a grammar with which the others are related, and a cosmic and societal diplomacy. Another dilemma, another important context, became aware out of the initiative of the nations to promote conferences to think among themselves and only among themselves about ayahuasca. It was like an accumulation of factors. We were planning information and consultation events together with indigenous organizations and the federal organization, the National Foundation of the Indians, when the second World Ayahuasca Conference took place in Acre, Brazil, where the subject of heritage building took over the representations of the nations on the need of getting prepared and free, which became even more apparent and urgent. Two own conferences were held, Koyuakahaira, like talking among ourselves what is certain. Among them, they talked about heritage building and expansion of ayahuasca of the world. The main matters were protection of traditional knowledge, not only in ayahuasca, but also the other sacred and medicinal plants. Another concern was the criminalization of those who travel to other parts to make ceremonies in Europe, Israel, South America, North America, South Brazil, and so on. Another was the handling and growing of the plants producing ayahuasca, knowing that there is a big pressure on the resources. They discussed also innovation of tradition. What are the limits? Out of understanding the young, the youth, and the elder. I understand that the second part, in the second indigenous conference that took part in 2018, the emphasis was placed on creation, governance, instance, and heritage building came out from the core of the debate. There is a clear understanding that the future of knowledge, whatever, is intimately related with the process occurred with medicine, like the coca leaves, tobacco, and so on. If the centers of the north are more under control of the substances, there will be consequences of the poor in the Amazon, that's clear. Knowing the cultural change that brings about the division of labor between the geopolitical north and south, that in the last centuries changed the role of raw materials and extracted materials with the nations of America. An answer was provided by the indigenous delegation in their own self-managed place, and the shared panels, only sharing alliances for defending their territories, rights, and environment, and doing this, and they believe that by means of ayahuasca, the communication and this understanding will go beyond the material, spurred by the Great Spirit. Thank you very much.
Obrigado. Por suerte tenemos tiempo.
Fortunately, we have time for some questions.
Few questions.
Hola.
Hello, my name is Gonzalo Marquez. I am a criminal lawyer, but my wife is also indigenous. Well, born in the Amazon forest. We came here 3 years ago. My firm is a big participation, 90% of anti-drug operations in Mallorca, but so far none has been related to ayahuasca. So I would like to ask you regarding confiscation and seizure. As far as what I know is that the seizure process is sent to health or toxicology institute, except for a little amount that is left for samples. I don't know if currently there is a way of channeling this seizure process before the substance is destroyed in order to recover it. Sim, yes. It's a complex thing, and this is what depends if you can use it or not. Well, people say it's illegal, it is not, but if in the end it's immobilized and destroyed, in the end we have nothing. So that's what occurs. These are administrative traditions, because on the one side you have legislation, and the other side the judges with the principles of independence. They can do whatever they will. So there are administrative habits created saying this looks like drug to the toxicology institute. We keep the sample, the rest is destroyed. This, with time, judges have to be educated. So they create this awareness saying, well, this at least is doubtful. It may be a drug or not. So the only thing that is left is keeping the solution and at most asking for heritage responsibility from the administration and have alleviating effects. So in this case, they had to give back. For instance, in Panasco, with the cannabis, it was destroyed and was given back. And this would be the same here. The other thing is the seizures, apart from this tradition. This is something I couldn't comment. The only legal loophole is a measure allowed by the drug law, which is that substances are seized when there is, according to the law, an extraordinary health risk. Well, the problem here is that it seems that there is like an overall instruction of seizing these substances, but it's rather a customs matter. But the law says a certain extraordinary risk is necessary, but this is interpreted very lightly by the courts, that should be ad hoc, case by case, but it seems that they take such an instruction and systematically dynamic is repeated. And they said at the beginning, it's a matter of educating by and by.
Buenas tardes.
Good evening. I'm an international lawyer. I work in Eastern Europe. I also hold speeches about the plants and research shamanism. We have problems in Russia, and we know that in Russia there's a shaman who is in jail. And less than 1 year ago, we have a Peruvian Russian who was also, he had 2 liters of the medicine seized. Now we're looking at this case. So what mechanisms are there at international level to provide support to these people? Because the minimum the minimum is sentence is 11 years to lifelong. This law was approved half a year ago. So what would be the support mechanism to us who are seeing these cases, support at international level? Usually, as I try to explain, Russia is a country that is very challenging due to its legal system and because the judicial power does not take many considerations when esteeming a case on plants, because they tend to reduce everything to their active molecules, the substance that has been seized or is in conflict with the law. So usually it's a case we have in the ADF, I think, because we have 2 cases awaiting trial, and we started a new strategy, which is rather enlarging it to the diplomatic channels. I don't know if this person, what is the nationality, but usually if it's a person who is not a Russian national, it is more likely that we may have a parallel conversation at diplomatic level, as it occurred in a similar case where an extradition of a person to Brazil, since this was no crime in Brazil, well, the judge can explain it better than me. But if this is the case, obviously, if it is not the person I believe it is, I would like to ask you to contact ADF so we can take forces together and find a common strategy.
Therapeutic that was arrested in Russia, he was convicted, and there was a mobilization, a diplomatic mobilization from Brazilian authorities, and they were able to bring this therapeutic to, it was not an extradition, it was only to serve the sentence in Brazil. Instead of being in jail in Russia, they allowed this person to come to Brazil, but to serve the sentence he received in Russia. That was the final outcome of this case.
Soy Cristiane de Brasil.
I'm Cristiane from Brazil, and my question is for Tadeu Feijão. I've heard several times this conference that it is very important to know our sacred plants and also not to commercialize ayahuasca tea and the charity and care work to change the society to the positive in a fairer, more egalitarian way. So my question is, what is the importance of all religions, of all ayahuasca religions, in going towards this direction together with ethics, stringency, seriousness, and no commercialization?
Religions, but I see that the challenge has grown. In the beginning, it was a chief of police. Then we had the Bishop of Porto Velho. Then we had the Brazilian government through one of its agencies. Then we had the FBI in the United States, and now we see the government of Russia imprisoning people. So the challenge has grown a lot. And of course, we need to unite to defend what we think is right. Because an injustice done to one person is a menace to all of us. So we have to be very careful not to put our own ways of thinking before the good of mankind. And I think at this moment, ayahuasca is needed to steer many of the values of the society. And I believe that ayahuasca is a human asset, and we have to treat it as such.
Hola, buenas tardes. Ante todo, quiero agradecer.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank you for this space, especially to the Ayahuasca Defense Forum. I work with medicine, and personally it has helped me at the moment to find an organization, institution to turn to find support with professionals behind. And when you find legality in these cases, you don't know whom to address. Most lawyers don't have any idea at the European level, and they just deal with it as a further drug. And even though the case didn't go further, it helped me to have people there giving me this advice. In that moment, I found the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, and I found also a catalog for requirements, what is necessary for a group or an association working with the medicine, because in case of necessity need, they are defended, and the defense is taken from your foundation. So my question is easier. Since we have the possibility of having you all legal specialists here, how can we who work with this medicine in Europe, how can we work in a legal way? So what advice can you give? How can we be on the safe side? Well, who dares to answer? Well, usually it's like reducing legal risk, and it's minimizing the impact of seizure or conflict, which is circumstantial, but depending on the country where you are. So it was difficult to us. So we've gone for two channels. First, through the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, which what they do is to react to any conflict or tension. Or also, and the other is a more proactive strategy, which is staying in contact with local lawyers who know much better the national system than we do. And also, from ISERS, with another program looking for best practices where we can look for a self-regulation model and leave behind this need for over-regulating, because the experience tells us that we're not very good at doing nothing else. So in this sense of how can we do it in a legal way, there should be regulation, and also doing it in a country where there is a certain jurisprudence or a certain legal evolution where you can have a protection more in trust. But I know this is the case in Spain or at the European level, where I can tell you that every country has a different answer with different notions. I don't know if Antonio has a better answer. I would like to say the problem we have from a criminal law point of view is that if happens what usually happens, that the courts still have this tradition that it's a drug, the only loophole you have to escape the sentence is this requires that all people consume, and in the Supreme Court terminology are addict to this shared consumption, and you cannot have the situation of delivery by a third person, which occurs with eutherapeutes, because that would be out of this shared consumption, would turn you into dealers. So you need to stick to this interpretation of the international covenants, because if you leave it, in the case of the churches, they have no problem, because there it's a substance that is out of the community and for the whole community. But in the case of therapeutists, You have in Spain less legal margin, even if it's in exchange for nothing, if you deliver to third parties. So it would be as drug trafficking in our country. So in this respect, it's tricky, it's difficult.
We are facing a real challenge about regulating the use of ayahuasca in Europe right now. For example, we have seen in this conference several people talking about the guidelines, international guidelines. That is a document with specialists from several countries and UN member states. And this is a beginning that could change the culture and the way governments and legislators will view this rich phenomenon. And as I said in my presentation, we still need to educate, to inform people, because in general they do not know what ayahuasca is. And when they do not know, they treat it as a drug. And it's tricky, like the other speakers said. And people that are using ayahuasca in Europe need to have the proper care and caution. For example, in France, it is expressly prohibited. So people that intend to use it in France need to know that if you are catch with ayahuasca there, probably you will face a criminal suit and respond as a drug dealer. But in most countries of Europe, we see what we call a gray zone. It is not prohibited, but it's not allowed, and we still need to fill out this space with the different proposals we have of how to use it in a responsible way. So we're still developing this policy, and this is the beginning. We do not have a lot written about the subject, the legal subject of the use of ayahuasca still. So this is only the beginning, and it's not an easy answer.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Cristina María, muchas gracias por estar aquí.
My name is Cristina Maria. Thank you very much for being here.
My question is for the US, but with international influence. I'm going to say it in both English and Spanish if I have to. So, ayahuasca and other indigenous traditional medicines come from a long line of oral traditions rooted in curanderismo. And so we continue to blessedly look at it as a religious sacrament as well as something of a spiritual nature, but there's a real medical and medicinal component here that I'm wondering how we see it from a legal perspective and how that perspective can actually be put into practice and into policy legally so that those doctors from indigenous medicine ways can actually be given more clout or more weight and actually be justifiable in working with these medicines and using them in a more curative, in a curative fashion. I don't know if I have to repeat that in Spanish, that everybody got it. Great. Gracias.
Well, I believe that the main use of ayahuasca is for religious purposes. That's how it was used in the setting, in the original setting. When we talk about ayahuasca, for us in União do Vertal, we are not talking about DMT or Harmine or Hormoline. We are talking about a spiritual being that's materialized in a tea. And by the spiritual force that it conveys, it can cure if the person has the merit to be cured. But Western civilization has a way of turning anything into a medicine, into something that can be measured and sold. So I believe that to be respectful for the rituals, it's one of the fundamental elements for curing. Those people that the curandeiros cured, they did not take a medicine. They took a spirit. They were. It was a matter of a spiritual cure. That's how I see it.
I guess I'll add one small point here, which may be a little cognitively dissonant, which is that I think it's quite silly and in fact quite harmful to say that ayahuasca is not a drug. It is the definition. It has a psychoactive properties like other substances, and by saying that it is not a drug, that is implicitly putting people who use other psychoactive substances in beneficial ways in harm's way. And it's saying we're the good people and those are the bad people. And I think we have to be open to the fact that healing can occur in many different contexts. For many people, they prefer and find great benefit of using ayahuasca in an organized religious context. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there are many ways that people can find healing with ayahuasca and with other psychoactive substances. I just myself know many people who've used ayahuasca outside of organized religious contexts with great benefits, and I also know many people who've used ayahuasca in organized religious settings and experienced great harm. So I don't think we can draw a distinction there, and I think ultimately that is quite unethical and harmful to the larger goals that we share of protecting human rights.
I do not really agree with you, but from the legal standpoint. I do not completely agree with you, but from a legal standpoint, that is, I have said, and it's not me who is saying it, but the association, I think that from the legal standpoint, ayahuasca is not a drug, but is serious, and the IMCB says that. And if the psychotropic is the molecule is not chemically synthesized, is not a drug. Any plant, any peyote juice, from a legal standpoint, would be a drug. Notwithstanding the religious use. But that's something that I would like to point out from the legal standpoint. Allow me to give the floor to Natalia. She loves this kind of things because we're mixing pharmacological language, cultural language, legal language, and yes, precisely. And I think this is getting really interesting. I mean, this is a debate that we have had even within ICEERS. Language is very important when talking about substances because, of course, it's a drug beyond the concept and the strategy that we decide to follow. Defending ayahuasca as a drug or as something else, we need to pay attention to the language because it's like using ayahuasca as a psychedelics. Then there is story behind and a speech that has a lot of weight when we are defending the use of this plant as something that has been used for centuries. So we do not like to use the word psychedelic, drug, narcotic, psychotropic. So there is a list of words that in regulations and in law are important. So maybe for you it's an obvious thing that ayahuasca, it's no problem. But in other jurisdictions, like in Russia, the simple fact of it being considered like this, you could be in prison for 20 or 30 years because it's psychedelics or something that alters our conscience, so it's hallucinogenic. So the book we were mentioning before, we were saying that ayahuasca is not penalized under any treaty precisely because the ayahuasca is not within this legal definition of prepared substance that's in the Convention of 1971. So it's not a prepared substance, it's an infusion, a tea, a brew, and therefore it's just outside of the legal game. So the words that we use is key because we are talking of prison or not. I think it's quite easy to understand if we set it like this.
So I have a follow-up question on religious use in the U.S. based on the Supreme Court decisions. I know the UDV and Santo Daime have been specifically sanctioned, and you mentioned a sort of a terminology about groups that practice with religious sort of, I don't know what to call, what the words were. Have there been any tests of that definition or those parameters by groups that have ceremonies outside of those two groups? And do you have any recommendations for groups that are, for all practical purposes, practicing a religion with an altar and prayer and that sort of thing?
After the UDV ruling, there was a case in Oregon that someone tried to prosecute the Santo Daime, and that case was thrown out in court, and they cited the precedent from the UDV ruling. I'm not aware of other groups that have taken their cases to court. Natalia may know better than me, though. Okay. So, I mean, I would recommend, studying very closely what that ruling is and how they define religion, and trying to follow that as closely as possible so that if there is some sort of legal problem or if the case is brought to court, then you've already covered your bases ahead of time. It's quite a long list of provisions that have to be included in order for it to be considered a religion, and it doesn't always fit with our intuitive sense of it, since nowadays we tend to think of religion and spirituality in a more expansive context.
When Jag said that UDV is not does not fit the pattern of religion, well, that's not what the Supreme Court wrote. 1/3 of the process was to prove the sincerity and if we met all the criteria, and we did. So this is not a case to be debated because it's already been to a Supreme Court, and they have found that we failed and we fit all the criteria necessary to prove that UDV is a religion.
Yeah, I should add, I mean, the UDV was very smart about it in that they, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they really, were prepared for there to be a legal battle ahead of time and covered all their bases ahead of time and made sure that they were organizing themselves in a way that fit under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in the U.S., with the intention that, of eventually going through the court system. So it was quite well thought out beforehand.
I would add also that in all instances in U.S., the sincerity of UDV was recognized, not only in the Supreme Court, but in all instances, because this process came from the first instance up to the Supreme Court and took several years and millions of dollars. There isn't a definition of religion that will fit in a box, legally saying, in U.S. And I really don't know any country that has a clear and close definition of religion. It's a complex phenomenon, and it's hard to define in a fixed way. But some precedents in the U.S. will give you some guidance to know if your praxis is a sincere praxis and could be acknowledged by the government before going to a trial as a sincere religion. And in U.S. it was absolutely fundamental, the precedent of the U.S. Supreme Court in the peyote case. That precedent that was not a good precedent. It changed all the history, moving people around this cause to change the legislation. And then we had the Restoration Act, the Freedom of Religion Restoration Act, with more than 100 of civil society people, committees and institutions united and working with U.S. Congress to change the law. And after that, when the UDV case came to trial, the basis was different because it was established that we do not need to prove anything. The government that has to prove that he has a compelling interest to harm our faith.
If I can just follow up just briefly, my understanding is that there's actually an application that can be obtained from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and I've heard from several people who've considered groups that have considered trying to do that, is that it's a catch-22 because you have to be established, but if you've been established, then you've been breaking the law. So there's a little problem there. But I do know also that at least one person has been sanctioned as a therapist using ayahuasca in Southern California under the umbrella of the Daime Church. So I don't know if there are any other cases like that, or that's just what I know.
And all that I said is related to religious use. When you are talking about therapeutic use, that umbrella of religious use is not automatically applicable.
I understand that this therapist actually had 18 years of experience with the Daime Church, so that's why it sort of graded over.
Solo quise clarificar que
Let me just clarify that I was asking about when will we see this issue, medicine being a perspective of the curandero as applied in the traditional medicine in Peru, in many different places in the Amazon rainforest, and in the different lineages that are indigenous indeed. So I was not referring to religion that much, and I know that is the greatest group right now, and I understand this, but we have this healing part of the story, and with the curanderos, etc., we have a lot of information, and Peru and the Amazon being
actually the cradle of the whole system, and that ayahuasca was in the beginning of all this. And that is the issue. That is the question, because we are analyzing the topic from the religious perspective only, and it's good and it's cultural and it helps a lot. But the part with shamans and women medicine and the curanderas, women curanderas, for thousands of years they've been working as physicians, doctors, and they're, well, they are not in a good position right now. They are not, and their tribes are not either. Well, in that sense, some steps have been taken slowly but surely in some international rights or international law organizations. They try to acknowledge some of the traits in some plans, medicinal plans, some interpretation of the International Convention on the Economic Rights and Social Rights. The fact of being an indigenous person, this person is entitled to use his or her medicinal practices, and he or she is entitled for the protection of his or her minerals and plants and animals. So these interpretations have been knitting some sort of safety and security toward the indigenous peoples, and of course this would not apply to those who leave their place of origin. But again, certain interpretations are in favor of all this. But since this is facing a juridical system that's more binding, because all these bodies of right or of law is non-binding. You have the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples in Article 24 stating very clearly that the indigenous peoples are entitled to use their medicinal plants and their traditions and their own healthcare systems, but they clash against very rigid systems where these substances might be banned because they're harmful for health. We should wonder whether maybe they're harmful for health because they are banned, because they are prohibited. So really the healthcare system needs to be bottom up, and now we're going in the wrong direction. And that's my feeling. That's my personal view. I don't know what you think.
Quero hacer solo comentario.
Just a quick comment about the curanderos. My goal is to get to know what happens in Peru, because I'm not familiar with the situation. In Brazil, the curanderos, being typified as a curandero is in the criminal code. No indigenous person in Brazil would be actually contemplated or regarded him as curandero by himself or herself. In Brazil is very different, and there's the Afro-Brazilian traditions being followed in Brazil, and the perception there's something fake, and that is the situation in Brazil, at least. And again, I don't know about Peru. Let me just share with you an observation. The word medicine, the way in which we translate the word is approximate. It's an estimation, because the indigenous think that medicine is a translation of than religion, but every translation also may lead to some error or some slight error in some nuance. They understand it as a medicine, and that's the reality that I know. And it's not medicine as in the way we understand the medicine, because they have a different understanding of what the body is and what a therapy is and what health is. So it's not about claiming that we want to do the same that biomedicine does. You know what I mean? Health is achieved in different ways, in different manners, and it stems out of a balance that is both physical and spiritual. In this case, ayahuasca would be good for diagnosis, for diagnostic purposes. Yesterday in the indigenous space, there was a delegate very much concerned about what happens in Peru and Iquitos rather, about the impact of tourism, remote tourism and local attractions. And that person yesterday spoke about that in the indigenous space. And he said that when you undergo or establish a diagnosis, then you can collect medicinal plants, and this is not, I mean, this is not fake, because part of the active ingredients in pharmacology stem from the plants. And that is the perspective, the thing that health is born out of a balance, and it doesn't have to be fixed or static. It's spiritual in the end. That's what I want to say, and that's my emphasis. Health also has to do with the spirit, and that's significant, and that's very meaningful. So just wanted to share this about the terms and the terminology, because the translation of the concept, the word medicine, is not exact among the indigenous peoples. You know, pathological agents. This notion, this concept that we have, it just doesn't match what they understand by dolenza, for instance, in the indigenous tribes. Thank you.
Hello, I am Hella, and I have a question about Santo Daime in Netherlands. In 2011, I found them a legal church on internet, got instructed, and went there for my first experience. That was very good for me. I saw these practices safe and disciplined. From that time, I know that the church has been legal, it was legal for more than 20 years, without any major harmful incidents. Science has collected many new data, and beneficial ayahuasca is from that time. But the previous year, Santo Daime Church in Netherlands was outlawed again, and my spiritual practice that has helped me a lot is now illegal. What would be the best way to restore justice in that case?
Bueno, fue justamente.
It was right after this ruling by the court establishing that you could continue with the religion without the use of the sacrament because the substance was banned, because it was harmful for health. That's the paradigm. Is it toxic because it's banned? Is it banned because it's toxic? And one thing, when people say one thing and other people say another. There was an important change in Holland. It is true in the Netherlands for the use of ayahuasca, and as of then, well, no incidences. It's not been beneficial for the community, I know, but I also know that there is a strong community in the Netherlands, and their idea is to get together in order to gather best practices and reduce the impact on territory that was accepting legally the use of ayahuasca among churches, and now it's like it's taken a step back. And I know, as far as I know, and we have a case of a person that self-refers as indigenous, and he is in Holland, and we are in touch with lawyers there. We have a team that's fantastic, and they are devising an integral strategy to, again, well, fight for a favorable resolution. But as far as I know, the Netherlands is not quite a safe place yet to practice these religions, unfortunately.
Open towards helping the Santo Daime in Netherlands to restore justice in that question?
Sorry, I didn't understand very well the question.
Is Ayahuasca Defense Fund, the organization, working with Santo Daime Church in Netherlands, or are you open towards helping us in that question?
Sí, bueno, el Ayahuasca Defense Fund.
The ADF works. We don't care if it's religion, a religious group, or people. The lawyers that know the system, the local juridical legal system, they share their experiences so that we can devise a common strategy to prevent split strategies, and then as a community, of course, we want to go together and we want a resolution that favors us all as a group. And in the Netherlands, we are having a dialogue still to have a joint strategy. It's not that the ADF works in particular with Santo Daime, that's not the case, but we have had contacts with lawyers working with Santo Daime, so that the strategy is shared and common. I can give you the name, I can put you in contact with those lawyers if you need it.
Something. ICES and Ayahuasca Defense Fund are doing a great job giving information to lawyers in different parts of the world that need to bring this information to court. But this system only works if you give this information in time to make them arrive to the judge or to the court before the trial. What happened in Netherlands is that the trial was already done, and unfortunately an unhappy outcome came. And we are still analyzing what could be the consequences of this jurisprudence to the use of ayahuasca by religions in Netherlands.
Quisiera hacer un aporte sobre cómo.
I would like to say something from Peru as a national heritage, as it is medicine there, and as a country with this tradition of shamans for 1,000 years or more, we accept this as a medicine, not as a religion. The problem that we've had between traditional and conventional medicine has been that conventional medicine has always looked on top of the shoulder, looked traditional medicine from the top of the shoulder. It's my first time in Spain in a congress like this one, and I see things from our perspective, because we in Peru, we cure ourselves with the traditional medicine right since we are very little. And indigenous peoples don't go to hospitals because hospitals don't heal, they don't cure. And the legal system that is applied in the country, thanks to the great spirit, as I say, the grand spirit, the government has made it legal, so we make use of it, of the plant, with respect, and with our curanderos that are part of a lineage themselves, of a tradition. So the thing is, I wonder, is it or is it not medicine? It is medicine, as is many more things. I mean, we cannot reduce ayahuasca to just one single thing. It's medicine, it's cultural heritage, just like the coca leaf is recognized in Bolivia as a tool for social cohesion. Peyote is protected in Mexico for the indigenous peoples there. Peyote is protected in the United States of America. So clearly there is recognition in different countries for their different plants. But to be able to develop a healthcare system that regulates the use of plants based on the therapeutical value, I mean, we need to develop many more things. And at ICERS in particular, with Janice, who works in the scientific area at ICERS, we are trying to promote this very much. So another dimension of human rights in relation to psychoactive plants, the right to science, not just the right to science, the right to benefiting from scientific process. So there's this other wing, this other arm that emerges in order to surround the legal strategy for psychoactive traditional plants, by means of obtaining scientific evidence, and then we will be able to check that this is an integral medicine with its own therapies. But self-regulation would be good as well, of course. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks for sharing part of your immense knowledge. We don't have any more time left for questions. Terribly sorry. So we'll break for half an hour and we'll resume at 6:15. Thank you.